Good afternoon, Mark Sutton with HurricaneTrack.com here with your Hurricane and Hurricane HD video blog for Wednesday, the 7th of November, 2012. Today's big story, obviously this large coastal storm, the nor'easter, sitting off the northeast United States, and it's moving northeast. So that's a lot of the reasons why they call it a nor'easter. And pretty significant effects, though maybe not quite as bad as it could have been, because it's just a little bit farther offshore, sitting out here, the center. There's a pretty good cloud canopy in here and some strong northeast winds blowing in, but with it being just a little bit more offshore, I think the core of the strongest winds will remain just off the New Jersey and New York coastlines. New England still might get brushed with some of those storm force conditions, winds in excess of 60 miles per hour at times. A different satellite perspective of the storm system. The center of it sitting right in here, and pretty strong northeast winds blowing in. The afternoon high tide coming in right about now, and then 12 hours later, the early tomorrow morning high tide. Those two tide cycles coming up, these two high tide cycles, the one now and then the one late tonight. Once we get through those, I think we're home free. And there will be some minor to moderate flooding. Some of the areas where the dunes were completely flattened that are a lot more vulnerable now. Yes, there will be some roads that are flooded and maybe a little bit more structural damage. But the other good thing about this system, obviously, the first thing is it's not a hurricane. It's a more typical nor'easter, quite strong one, but it's moving parallel to the coast and it's going to move away instead of doing like Sandy did, where it comes in, pushing all of that water towards the coastline. So even though it does have that northeast fetch, the wind coming over a large extent of the water onshore, blowing it onshore, it's just the wind blowing that way. It's not the entire mass of the storm blowing that water towards the coast. So that's a little bit of good news there. Trying the best we can here to give some hope for folks up there who have certainly dealt with a lot. The surface map from the National Weather Service, you can see the center of the low. Again, pretty far off to the east compared to where some of the models had it. If it was, another 50 to 75 miles back to the west, that large cloud band and the precip shield and the heavy rain and wind would be right over the coastline and closer to the center, and you'd have a tighter pressure gradient in there and stronger winds. As it turns out, the radar signature, you can see that the extent of the precip shield goes back only just a little bit west of I-95 in most of the areas of the northeast, keeping D.C. Down here, Baltimore, out of the thick of it. So really just Philadelphia up through New York, and then the big cities of New England. Yes, going to be rainy, windy, the possibility of some frozen precip in some of the areas. Power outages a possibility, but I think it's just a little bit better overall than we were thinking it could have been, because the track of the system is staying far enough offshore to keep the worst of the convection that is associated with this system, the clouds that are thickest, just offshore, and maybe keeping the worst of the effects away as well. Speaking of the tropics, since this is a hurricane outlook, this time of year, the first 10 days of November, I like to use climatology as a guide. You can tell there's just a smattering, fairly evenly distributed, with one little cluster right here. If you had to pin it down and say where's the most active area this time of year, certainly the extreme western Caribbean, and then this one area here in the eastern Pacific. Otherwise, the eastern Atlantic is completely shut down by this time of year. We've never seen a Cape Verde type storm form this late in the year, that far east in the Atlantic. And this basically just means what you already know, and it's showing what you already know. And that is that once we get into November, things really start to calm down. Looking at a satellite picture of the tropics, first you can see the sort of the wound-up storm system up here. Non-tropical in nature, lots of cold air and energy coming in from the upper levels of the atmosphere. This is not a tropical system. It's what we call an extratropical storm or a mid-latitude cyclone. But down in the deep tropics, just one area of convection, just a little weak surface low down there. Strong southwest winds blowing out, as you'd expect this time of year. The big trough carved out. Very, very strong upper-level winds. Dry air abounds. Not much instability. The Madden-Julian oscillation, not very favorable right now, so we don't have a lot of upward motion down in this region, promoting the development of tropical convection. and it looks like things will stay that way. Sea surface temperatures still fairly warm. The 26 degrees Celsius line, which is about 79 degrees or so Fahrenheit, starting to shrink south now and push south, as you'd expect. The sun angle getting lower in the sky, so the energy getting input to the tropics is less and less each day. The departures from normal is pretty significant. Look at this. All along where Sandy impacted, very, very cold anomalies. The temperatures compared to normal knocked way down. But out in the tropical Atlantic, a very, very warm pattern, and we'll watch this in the off season. It doesn't really matter right now. It'll matter more, obviously, June, July, August, September of next year, but that's next year, and we'll worry about that when we get there. So that's a look at things today. The biggest story, obviously, the nor'easter, and, you know, in 48 hours it'll be gone, and by 3 to 4 days out, temperatures will be on the rebound up there, and I think that that will allow hope to return for people who were so heavily impacted by Sandy and then this current storm, and nothing brewing in the tropics. So that's the best news of all. Have yourselves a good rest of your Wednesday. Again, I'm Mark Sudduth for HurricaneTrack.com. Always my pleasure to produce these videos for Hurricane and Hurricane HD. I'll be back with another one tomorrow.